So here's the premise. What language did Jesus speak? And the Aramaic people say he only spoke Aramaic. What do we think? Let's take a look. Aramaic. Scroll on down to the word Aramaic. I did a cross-reference on that. When this was brought up to my attention years ago, this guy wanted a lot of money to help him reverse engineer the Bible from Greek into Aramaic. He didn't realize Jesus spoke a particular dialect of Aramaic, first century Judean area, just like the rest of the disciples, his disciples did. But that particular dialect of Aramaic isn't the only one, and the more popular one, upon which the Syriac version, the Peshitta, was based, was a translation from the Greek. So, take a look at what language did Jesus speak? Search for that. What language did Jesus speak? There it is. The call says, does this mean that Jesus spoke in Greek to his disciples and to the crowds, if, in fact, the original text of the church age scriptures, the 27 books, was in Greek? Does this mean that Jesus spoke in Greek to his disciples and to the crowds he addressed in his Galilean ministry? Probably not. I would say depends on the situation. Not all the time in Greek, not all the time in Aramaic, because he spoke to the woman in Samaria, and also he spoke to the Gentiles to the north. They didn't speak his dialect of Aramaic. And when he spoke to the Pharisees, probably not. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. It depends upon, because what we have to understand is that first century Israelis were either tri-lingual or even quadri-lingual, 3 to 4 languages. The languages spoken in Israel at the time of Christ were Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. Most Jewish people spoke the first 3, and some were conversant in Latin as well. Most of our readers know the difference between Greek and Latin, but there is some confusion about Hebrew and Aramaic. Hebrew was the language of the Old Testament with few exceptions, and has been adapted into modern Hebrew, the language spoken in Israel today. Modern Hebrew is similar to biblical Hebrew. Wow, all the way back to the 10th century, with the addition of new words, of course, vocabulary such as telephone, automobile, and television, and some very significant changes in syntax. In biblical Hebrew, the verb usually comes first, then the subject, and then the object. In modern Hebrew, the order of words is similar to English, with the subject first, then the verb, and then the subject. Hebrew was a dead language for over 2,000 years, used only for religious purposes, as was Latin. But now it is a living language once again in Israel, with a few grammatical changes. Aramaic is a different language from biblical Hebrew, though. They use the same alphabet, but much of the vocabulary and syntax are different. In fact, Hebrew and Aramaic were almost as different as English and German are today. Webster's Dictionary offers the following definition. Aramaic, a Semitic language of which documents are known from as early as 9th century BC. Originally the speech of the Aramaeans, but later used extensively in Southwest Asia as a commercial lingua franca and governmental language, and adopted as their customary speech by various non-Aramaean peoples, including the Jews, among whom it replaced Hebrew after the Babylonian exile. Thus, the Jewish people will learn to speak Aramaic and Hebrew in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity. The book of Daniel illustrates this transition. The first part of the book of Daniel was written in Hebrew, but as Daniel began to explain the prophetic dream to King Nebuchadnezzar, he switched to Aramaic, which is sometimes also called Syriac or Chaldee. The next several chapters of Daniel deal with the succession of Gentile world powers and written in Aramaic, and then the final chapters reverted to in Hebrew. So if you think back in your history about the huge areas and millions of people outside of the Judean area, there's going to be differences in the Aramaic. So Jesus didn't speak those different dialects of Aramaic. He spoke the local one for the Judean area, and also 3 other languages, most likely. When the Jewish people returned to Israel, they carried back with them the language they had learned in Babylon. Hebrew was used in the synagogue when the scriptures were read, but the language of the streets was Aramaic. This continued through the time of Christ, and it is probable that the language he most frequently used was common Aramaic. One source of confusion is that Aramaic had by Jesus' day become so identified with the Jewish people that it was commonly referred to as Hebrew, as it is in the New Testament, the Greek Bible of the church age. Note how the Gospel of John uses this term. In a place that is called the pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha, in a place that is called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew, Golgotha. Both Gabbatha and Golgotha are clearly Aramaic words. But John calls them Hebrew. Scholars explain to us that Hebrew, as commonly used in the New Testament, refers to the Aramaic or Chaldee language. A lot of times you'll take a word such as baptism. That's an English word, right? Transliterated from the Greek baptismo with the O after it. Gone. Eliminated. Languages adopt other words from other languages and phrases in whole sentences and incorporate that into their linguistic book. Hebrew, the Hebrew language, not that, however, in which the Old Testament was written, but the Chaldee, which at the time of Jesus and the apostles had long superseded it in Palestine. Perhaps this might be similar to calling the language spoken in America English, as opposed to that which was spoken in England, also referred to as English, but the difference between the two languages in Palestine was even much greater. Thus, the Hebrew language described in the New Testament is not biblical Hebrew, or even the Hebrew that is used today in modern Israel, but is rather Aramaic, the ancient language of Mesopotamia. In a very real sense, the language of Aramaic that Jesus and most of the people of Israel in his name spoke was as Gentile as the Greek language. Nevertheless, they also knew Greek, and if they did business with anybody in the Roman Empire, Latin. The process used for writing the Gospels, evidence shows that the Gospels, including Matthew and Mark, were originally written in Koine, common everyday first-century Greek. What then was the process used for writing the Gospels of Matthew and Mark? Tradition about Mark is that John Mark wrote his Gospel under the guidance and encouragement of the Apostle Peter. After the early years of the Christian movement, Peter apparently worked among the Jewish people of the diaspora, the banishment into Babylon, Jews living outside of Israel, disbursement, including Babylon, as indicated in his epistles. There's also one for the northern kingdom, when the Assyria conquered the northern 10 tribes. There's also the tradition that Peter spent his last years in Rome, although there is nothing in the scriptures to support this. In either case, Peter and Mark would have communicated primarily in Greek, rather than in Hebrew or Aramaic, since that was the common language among diaspora Jews, as well as of most Gentiles. Thus, there seems to be no reason why Mark would not have written his gospel in Greek as he recorded Peter's recollections of the events described. Besides, who's your audience? A large group of people, the whole of mankind. Get into a language that people can then translate into other languages quickly, and that's what they did. This leaves the Gospel of Matthew. Of the 4 Gospel writers, Matthew is the only one who was both an eyewitness to almost all of the events in Galilee and Jerusalem, and also wrote his Gospel near the beginning of the Christian movement. Matthew is an interesting personality who is often overlooked. Dr. Karsten Peter Thiede, in his recent book, Eyewitness to Jesus, Amazing New Manuscript Evidence about the Origin of the Gospels, observes that Matthew, as a tax collector, probably a supervisor of the Capernaum office, undoubtedly had important writing skills. You think multilingual? You think? It has been discovered that the ancients who were skilled in writing had developed a form of shorthand so that they could take dictation. It is not outside the realm of possibility that Matthew could have written down entire passages, such as the Sermon on the Mount and the Olivet Discourse, just as Jesus delivered them, verbatim in shorthand. Later, the faithful tax collector could have assembled his notes and written his narrative with the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. As stated above, Jesus probably delivered most of his messages in Aramaic, and therefore Matthew could have necessarily taken a shorthand in the dictation in Aramaic. Was he not multilingual? Of course. Would he then have written his gospel in Aramaic? We truly do not know. All we know for certain is that perhaps as early as 66 A.D., as Thiede suggests, the Gospel of Matthew was distributed in the Greek language as far as Egypt. Any evidence of Aramaic? No. If Matthew was still in Israel when he wrote his gospel, it would seem appropriate that he would have used Israel's common language, Aramaic. In that case, his gospel would have been translated into Greek quite early, before 66 A.D. And how was it distributed? Well, we find nothing but evidence in the Greek. It should be noted that Matthew's gospel has more Hebraisms than any other of the others. This suggests an earlier Aramaic version, although, as indicated above, no early Aramaic version has been found. And again, why not, when you adopt all kinds of things from another language because of a history or whatever, into your own language, like English does? We don't speak English, do we? We speak American English. There are lots of things in American English, though, that are adopted from the Old English and from other countries as well. A lot of German expressions as well, especially in medical scientific fields, because Germany was well noted, and still is, in the scientific written material. Another explanation is it is not uncommon to have insertions of another language, I just said this, into an original writing in a different language to better express the point to be made. I got baptized. That's Greek. Well, yeah, that's a Greek word. We translate it into English, especially considering the background of the events. The Hebraisms, I finally got that right, portraying in a much more accurate concept for those particular expressions in the Hebrew. HaMashiach. I hear that all the time, too. I like that. HaMashiach, Messiah. What's the Messiah come from? Mashiach. Thus, there is no evidence that the Gospels were written originally in any other language but Greek. When you got evidence, work with it. When you have skepticism, keep it to yourself. If there were versions of Matthew or of the other Gospels originally penned in Aramaic, in accordance with the language Christ used, they were so quickly translated into Greek so that they could be utilized throughout the Roman world. Both Greek and Aramaic were essentially Gentile languages, and the Lord was able and willing to use them to convey his teachings so that the good news could go forth from his homeland of Israel to the uttermost parts of the earth. Now, I'd make one comment on that. What do we find that verifies the fact that the Bible is inerrant? We find it from the Greek original text, properly translated into my language, which is American 21st century English. Why? Because I live in the 21st century in America. And when you look at, do we have a proper translation? I use 7 English translations, American English, and I go back to the original text, manuscript evidence. I have the book by Comfort and all kinds of stuff on the internet. You can get what the original text most likely was. When there's any discrepancy, you can resolve it immediately. Most of the time it's inconsequential. Incidentally, upon careful examination, it becomes evident that every book of the New Testament is inerrant and completely harmonious with all the other books of the Bible in the Greek, so we are assured that we have the communication of God to the world as it stood over all these years, and so we say, well, that was probably inspired by the Holy Spirit. Nothing, no new translations in English or other languages, because there are a lot of differences and discrepancies, but we can resolve the problems amongst the Greek manuscripts and the New Testament writers and early church fathers copied much of what they knew back in the 1st century, 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries of what they thought was the original text. And boy, we have 55,000 documents to verify what the original text was. And so we find that that indeed was inspired by the Holy Spirit. We find no evidence whatsoever of any other language that might have been inspired. So,